What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. 13 small but poignant facts we just learned about George Washington. As a leader of the American Revolutionary War and first president of the United States of America, George Washington looms larger than life. But interesting facts about George Washington and tiny details about his life reveal the human side of this titan of American history. Born on February 22, 1732, in colonial Virginia, George Washington's childhood didn't necessarily foretell his future fame. He fought in the French and Indian War as a young man, an experience that he would brilliantly call upon decades later in the American Revolution. Washington was already one of the wealthiest people in the nation when he became president in 1789. In 1759, he married Martha Custis, who brought him both happiness and wealth. However, it came at a cost: the freedom of hundreds of enslaved workers at Mount Vernon. On December 14, 1799, George Washington died. During his lifetime, he was instrumental in transforming America from a collection of colonies into a single nation. The private, everyday things about George Washington on this list transform the venerated founding father into who he really was: a flawed human who struggled with his own challenges, took up his own interests, and lived an imperfect life. He loved dogs so much that he once called for a ceasefire to return his enemy's terrier. George Washington delighted in dogs. As a hunter, he kept a well-stocked kennel of hounds at Mount Vernon, and he's often credited with helping develop the American foxhound breed. Washington, like many dog owners, gave his dogs distinctive names like Tipsy and Truelove. Washington's love of dogs even guided his conduct on the battlefield. While leading troops at the Battle of Germantown in 1777, some soldiers picked up a lost terrier. Its collar indicated it belonged to General William Howe, head of British troops. Washington groomed the dog, called for a suspension of hostilities, and returned the terrier with a note to Howe. General Washington's compliments to General Howe. A dog that accidentally fell into General Washington's hands and appears to belong to General Howe, as indicated by the inscription on the collar, is returned to General Washington for his pleasure. He was a devoted father to his stepchildren, grandchildren, and wards. George Washington never fathered his own children. Washington probably became sterile due to illness, as Martha Custis had children from her first marriage. John and Patsy, his surviving children, were raised and loved by Washington as if they were his own children. He also assisted in the upbringing of his step-grandchildren, nieces, and nephews. Though he was a disciplinarian, Washington tried to guide his young charges on matters of the heart as well. The brother he idolized passed prematurely. Lawrence, Augustine, and Jane were George Washington's three older half-siblings from his father's first marriage. George had a special bond with Lawrence, whom he admired greatly. Given the age difference, Lawrence was 16 years older than George, and the fact that their father passed in 1743, Lawrence became a father figure to his younger brother. When Lawrence came down with what was probably tuberculosis, George accompanied his brother to Barbados for what they hoped was better air in 1751. Didn't work. Lawrence succumbed to his ailments the next year. Lawrence's passing was one of the tragedies of George's young life. As a boy, he was so committed to becoming a gentleman that he copied out 110 rules of etiquette. George Washington was probably not educated, despite the fact that he was born into a wealthy family. His hopes of going to England for school were dashed when his father passed when Washington was 11. His schooling probably stopped when he was 15. However, this did not mean that he stopped learning for himself. He improved his manners as part of his self-education so that he could embody gentlemanly virtues. The young Washington actually learned how to behave by copying 110 rules from an etiquette book that told him how to act. Before meeting his future spouse, he had been unlucky in love. In 1759, a 26-year-old George Washington wed a wealthy widow, 27-year-old Martha Custis. But though their marriage was happy and loving, Custis wasn't his only love. After at least 3 other women, Mary Eliza Phillips, Betsy Fauntleroy, and Frances Alexander, turned down Washington's marriage proposal, Washington proposed to Custis. Before he became attached to Custis, Washington's greatest love was Sally Fairfax. Washington could never shake the love he had for Fairfax in his youth, even though he was content with his wife. In a letter that he sent to her in 1798, he stated that he would never be able to forget those happy times, the best of my life, that he had spent with her. At Valley Forge, soldiers performed his favorite play. Going to the theater was one of George Washington's favorite pastimes. As biographer Ron Chernow recounts, Washington once attended the theater 5 nights during a single week in June 1770. In point of fact, he was so in love with the theater that he even ordered soldiers to perform a play at Valley Forge because he thought it would boost morale. They performed Cato, which happened to be Washington's favorite play. He loved to dance for hours. Although George Washington is best known for his combat prowess, he was also well known for his dancing prowess. Like many gentlemen of his class, Washington had studied dance as a young man and could demonstrate his refinement through dancing. Though tall, he was famously graceful. The American Revolution didn't even stop Washington from dancing. After attending a ball in March 1779, General Nathanael Greene recalled, "His Excellency General Washington and Mrs. Greene didn't stop dancing for more than 3 hours. He chose to lead the new nation without compensation." Admirers claimed George Washington embodied civic virtue when he declined a salary as the first president of the United States. However, Washington's move was smart, not patriotic benevolence. He only requested that Congress pay for his office-related expenses in lieu of a salary. He ended up spending $25,000, which is what he would have received in the form of a salary. He lost his mother to breast cancer just before he was elected president. George Washington's relationship with his mother, Mary Ball Washington, was strained. George, her eldest son, became resentful of her frequent requests for assistance and financial support. After all, as a young widow with 6 children, her position was precarious. His mother passed 2 years short of seeing her son become the first president of the United States. In August 1787, she succumbed to breast cancer. He was infected with smallpox, which left him permanently scarred. One of the most feared diseases of the 18th century was smallpox, which could have been fatal or disfigured survivors. George Washington came down with smallpox in 1751 when he was in Barbados. Though he survived after weeks of suffering the intense symptoms, the disease permanently touched him. The pox left scars on his face. Washington was lucky, however, since his scarring was relatively mild. He probably suffered from dental problems for the rest of his life, which probably caused him constant pain. Throughout his entire life, George Washington struggled with dental issues. As a result, he lost teeth and needed dentures after having some extracted. Washington's dentures were from a variety of materials, perhaps including teeth from enslaved people. Though Washington was dependent on the dentures to eat and speak, they were painful to wear and required him to avoid hard food. His will granted freedom to his enslaved workers, sort of. Slavery was undeniably part of George Washington's life. When he was 11 years old, his late father left him 10 enslaved workers, and he started owning people. His eventual inheritance of Mount Vernon, marriage to Martha Custis, and slave purchases ultimately yielded him 317 enslaved men, women, and children. By the end of his life, Washington believed that freeing his enslaved workers was good for his legacy. Therefore, his will decreed that the enslaved people who belonged to him would be freed. In fact, he was the only founding father to request manumission in his will. But it wasn't that simple. Washington stipulated that the enslaved should be freed on the passing of his wife. She eventually freed them before her passing, though she kept the enslaved humans owned by the Custis family. He inherited Mount Vernon only after multiple family members passed. Perhaps no place is as closely associated with George Washington as Mount Vernon. His Virginia plantation, but he almost never even owned it. It's likely that George didn't anticipate acquiring Mount Vernon as a child. When their shared father, Augustine Washington, passed away in 1743, it was supposed to go to his older half-brother Lawrence. In fact, Lawrence was the one who was supposed to receive it. In 1752, Lawrence passed away too soon, and Mount Vernon went to his young daughter Sarah. After Sarah's passing, the estate went to her mother and, finally, to George. As a leader of the American Revolutionary War and the first President of the United States, George Washington looms larger than life, but the small, personal facts about him can be even more telling than his military or political legacy. Born on February 22, 1732, in colonial Virginia, George Washington's life began not with grand promise, but with the humbleness of a child who would later be shaped by loss, discipline, love, war, and ambition. His father died when he was just 11, cutting short any plans to be educated in England and forcing Washington to rely on practical learning and self-education. Young Washington had already suffered a great deal of loss when he went to fight in the French and Indian War. In 1751, he went to Barbados with his older half-brother Lawrence, his idol and father figure, in a last-ditch effort to recover from tuberculosis. George also developed smallpox during the trip, which resulted in permanent scarring. However, it also provided him with immunity, which would come in handy in the future. Washington trained himself in the manners of a gentleman by copying 110 etiquette rules despite his lack of formal education. This demonstrates his determination to rise above circumstances and conform to the ideals of dignity and leadership. Washington's personal life was equally complex. He was a loving stepfather to the two children of his wife Martha Custis, whom he married in 1759, despite the fact that he never had biological children, possibly as a result of complications from smallpox or another illness. He also played a fatherly role to grandchildren, nieces, nephews, and other wards. His romantic heart was not devoid of longing, despite the warmth of his family. One of the great unrequited loves of his youth was Sally Fairfax, a married woman and the wife of his friend. Years after they had parted ways, he told her that those were the best days of his life, revealing a more tender and vulnerable side of the stoic figure admired by history books. That he found deep emotional resonance in his youthful love, even while remaining a devoted husband, illustrates the private duality of his emotional life. Washington was also a man who deeply loved the arts and leisure. He was an avid theatergoer, and even during the harshest winter at Valley Forge, he had his favorite play, Cato, performed by his troops to uplift morale. He delighted in dancing as well, and once danced for over 3 hours with General Nathaniel Greene's wife, never allowing war or duty to diminish his joy in life. He was also fond of dogs, and Washington was famous for keeping kennels of hounds and helping to create the American foxhound breed. He named his dogs affectionately, with names like Sweetlips, Vulcan, and Drunkard, and even during the American Revolutionary War, he once called a temporary ceasefire to return a lost terrier to British General William Howe, grooming it and sending it back with a polite note. His sense of decency and honor extended even to his enemies. Politically, Washington was not just an icon of virtue. He was also shrewd. Though often celebrated for refusing a presidential salary as a symbol of civic virtue, he instead asked Congress to reimburse his expenses, an amount that equaled what he would have earned. A man whose ideals and financial prudence were in balance is shown by this practical decision. Washington was not without moral complexity, particularly in his ownership of enslaved people. When he married Martha Custis, she brought considerable wealth, including enslaved workers, into the marriage, and Washington benefited from that system even while expressing ambivalence about slavery later in life. His evolution on this issue was slow and painful, much like the nation's. In his will, he made arrangements for his enslaved laborers to be released upon Martha's death, a small but significant act in an era when few people took that step. He succumbed to a sudden illness on December 14, 1799, just 2 years after his mother Mary Ball Washington, whom he revered and resented for her demanding nature, passed away. One of the subtle ironies in a life filled with contradictions is that she did not live to see her son become president. George Washington was a man of war and peace, duty and passion, triumph and suffering. These small but poignant facts, his scars from smallpox, his unrequited love, his devotion to stepchildren, his love of theater and dogs, and even his pragmatic view on finances, paint a fuller, richer portrait of a man often frozen in marble. They show that behind the monumental legacy was a complex, deeply human figure who loved, lost, learned, and led a new nation with all the imperfections of a mortal man. When George Washington learns these personal stories, he becomes less of a distant founding father and more like the man we might recognize today. Flawed, striving, principled, and deeply human. The human side of an American icon. 13 poignant facts about George Washington. The person who built the monument. An introduction in the history of the United States. George Washington is regarded as a giant because he was the indomitable general who led a small army to victory over the British Empire, the reluctant president who upheld the integrity of his position, and the unifying figure whose leadership contributed to the formation of a nation from 13 divided colonies. Currency, monuments, and textbooks all feature his image, which frequently depicts him as an almost mythical figure of flawless virtue. Yet beneath this marble facade lay a deeply human individual, one who experienced heartbreak, failure, love, and personal struggles just like any other man. These 13 small but poignant facts peel back the layers of legend to reveal Washington as he truly was. A complex, flawed, and fascinating human being. From his love of dogs to his secret heartbreaks, from his lifelong quest for refinement to his conflicted relationship with slavery, these details illuminate the private man behind the public hero. 1. The dog owner who requested a ceasefire in exchange for a terrier. One of the most endearing stories about Washington reveals both his compassion and his love for animals. His troops encountered a small, terrified terrier on the battlefield during the Battle of Germantown, 1777. The dog's collar indicated that it belonged to Washington's adversary, British General William Howe. Rather than keep the dog as a trophy of war, Washington, an avid fox hunter who bred hounds at Mount Vernon, ordered a temporary ceasefire. He returned to Howe with the following polite note after feeding and cleaning the dog: the compliments of General Washington to General Howe. He does himself the pleasure to return him a dog, which accidentally fell into his hands. Why it matters. Washington's belief in honorable conduct even in war was demonstrated by this small act of chivalry. 2. Stepfather, devoted but strict. Though Washington never fathered biological children, historians speculate that a bout of smallpox or tuberculosis may have left him sterile. He became a loving stepfather to Martha's 2 children, Jackie and Patsy Custis, and later helped raise his step-grandchildren. He paid for their education and personally disciplined them when needed. When Patsy died at 17 from an epileptic seizure, Washington was heartbroken, writing of his grief in his diary. He later took in orphan nieces, nephews, and family friends, treating them as his own. Why it matters. His role as a family man contrasts with his stern military image, showing his capacity for deep personal affection. 3. The teenager who copied 110 rules of etiquette. Born into Virginia's gentry but lacking formal schooling, young George was determined to become a proper gentleman. At 16, he meticulously copied 110 rules from Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior, a guidebook on manners. Highlights include: every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those present. Bedew no man's face with your spittle by approaching too near when you speak. Why it matters. Washington's disciplined character and reputation for politeness were shaped by these rules, demonstrating his lifelong commitment to self-improvement. 4. The ex-suspect who ate love but never forgot his first love before marrying Martha Custis, a wealthy widow. Washington proposed to at least 3 other women, all of whom turned him down. Betsy Fauntleroy rejected him twice. Mary Eliza Phillips, a New York heiress. Alexander Francis, the wife of his neighbor Sally Fairfax, was his greatest unrequited love. Even after marrying Martha, he wrote to Sally in 1798, "The happiest moments of my life were those I spent with you." Why it matters. Even America's founding father knew the sting of romantic rejection, and the bittersweet ache of a love that could never be. 5. The theater enthusiast who staged plays at Valley Forge. During the brutal winter at Valley Forge, 1777–78, when his troops were starving and freezing, Washington ordered them to perform Cato, his favorite play about Roman virtue and resistance to tyranny. He believed it would boost morale. "What pity is it that we can die but once to serve our country?" A famous line from the play became a Revolutionary War rallying cry. Why it matters. It shows Washington's theatrical side and his understanding of culture's power to inspire. 6. The surprisingly graceful dancer. Despite his towering height, 6 feet 2 inches, Washington was known for his grace on the dance floor. At a 1779 ball, he and Nathaniel Greene's wife danced for over 3 hours without stopping. He had studied dance as a young man, a mark of refinement for Virginia gentlemen. Even during the Revolution, he made time for balls and social gatherings. Why it matters. It humanizes him, showing he enjoyed life's pleasures even amid war. 7. The president who denied a salary. Despite the expenses to taxpayers, Washington declined a salary as president, asking only that his expenses be covered. He spent $25,000, equivalent to $750,000 today, on official costs. Critics joked he lived like a king anyway. Why it matters. The gesture was symbolic. He wanted to avoid corruption accusations while maintaining dignity in office. 8. The son who had a complicated relationship with his mother. Washington's mother, Mary Ball Washington, was a strong-willed widow who frequently asked him for money. Their relationship was strained, with George resenting her demands. She died of breast cancer in 1789, just months before his inauguration. "You will soon discover that office is not all profit," were her final words to him. Why it matters. It reveals the personal burdens he carried even at the height of his public career. 9. The smallpox survivor who pioneered inoculation. At 19, Washington survived smallpox during a trip to Barbados. His face was permanently scarred by the disease. His immunity later helped him protect troops by advocating for inoculation. Why it matters. His scars served as a constant reminder of his mortality, and his forward-thinking leadership in the medical field saved many lives. 10. The man who freed his slaves, but only after death. Privately opposed to slavery, Washington was a reluctant slaveholder who feared economic collapse if freed. His will emancipated his slaves after Martha's death. She set them free early out of fear of revolt. Why it matters. It shows his moral conflict, a man who fought for liberty yet struggled to fully live its ideals. Conclusion. The flawed man who became a legend. These 13 intimate details remind us that Washington was not a flawless icon but a real man, with loves, losses, quirks, and contradictions. His greatness lay not in perfection, but in his ability to rise above human flaws to lead a nation. By understanding his humanity, we better appreciate the extraordinary legacy he left behind.